After 2 decades behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, a man returns with a hidden agenda. He begins targeting those responsible, uncovering a web of corruption that shakes the city to its core. Welcome to Podcast Stories. I'm your host, Mark Johnson. If you love your family and love to listen to interesting stories like this, subscribe to our channel. And now, put your headphones on and let's dive into this story.
The metal gates of Sterling State Penitentiary creaked open on a gray Monday morning. Marcus Thompson, now 48, stepped out wearing an ill-fitting suit provided by the prison system. His possessions fit in a small paper bag, a wallet with expired ID, a watch that stopped working years ago, and $200 in release money. The guard's words echoed in his head. "Good luck out there, Thompson." The world hit him like a tidal wave. Cars looked different, sleeker, quieter. Everyone walked with their heads down, staring at small, glowing rectangles in their hands. Digital billboards flashed advertisements he didn't understand, promoting services he'd never heard of. Even the air felt different, heavy with the weight of 2 lost decades. Marcus stood at the bus stop, watching people tap plastic cards instead of depositing coins. A young woman noticed his confusion and helped him buy a ticket with cash. On the ride to his old neighborhood, he observed how people spoke differently, used unfamiliar slang, and seemed perpetually connected to their devices. The city had changed too. New buildings towered where familiar landmarks once stood, and businesses he remembered were replaced by coffee shops and tech stores. Getting off in his old neighborhood, East Side, the contrast was stark. While downtown gleamed with progress, East Side had deteriorated. The local grocery store, where his mother used to shop, was now a boarded-up shell covered in graffiti. Kids in worn clothes played in front of abandoned buildings. Drug deals happened openly on corners, where he used to wait for the school bus. His childhood home on Maple Street stood in disrepair. The white paint had peeled away to expose rotting wood. The front porch, where he used to spend summer evenings with his family, had partially collapsed. Through a broken window, he could see the interior had been stripped by looters. 20 years ago, this street had been full of working families. Now it was a testament to neglect and poverty. Standing there, the full weight of his loss crushed him. His parents had died while he was inside. His father from heart failure 5 years into his sentence. His mother from cancer 3 years later. His younger sister had moved away, leaving no forwarding address. 2 decades of birthdays, holidays, and daily moments gone, stolen by a wrongful conviction. The employment office directed him to Mike's Auto Repair, one of the few businesses still operating in East Side. The owner, an old-timer who remembered the neighborhood's better days, took a chance on him despite his record. That's where he met Carlos Rodriguez, a 24-year-old mechanic with quick hands and a quicker mind. Carlos wasn't like the others who treated Marcus with suspicion or pity. When Marcus struggled with the shop's computerized diagnostic system, Carlos stayed late to teach him. "Technology's just tools," Carlos would say, guiding Marcus through the interfaces. "The principles of engines haven't changed. They just wrapped them in fancy computers." During lunch breaks, they shared stories. Carlos told him about growing up in East Side, watching it change, and his dreams of opening his own shop someday. Marcus found himself opening up about life inside, the constant vigilance required to survive, and the hope that kept him going. Carlos listened without judgment, offering friendship instead of sympathy. One evening, as they closed up the shop, Carlos asked about Marcus's conviction. The older man hesitated, then shared the basics: a drug-related murder he didn't commit, a rushed trial, and a public defender who seemed more interested in closing the case than finding the truth. Carlos absorbed the information silently, then said something that would change everything. "My cousin's girlfriend works at the courthouse. She says half the cops from back then were dirty, especially Detective Williams. He's still around, you know. Got promoted to captain last year." Marcus kept his expression neutral, but inside, a spark of purpose ignited. For the first time since his release, he felt something beyond loss and displacement. He had a direction. The world might have changed, but corruption, it seemed, remained constant. As he walked to his small rented room that night, Marcus began to plan. 20 years of his life had been stolen, but now he had a chance to uncover the truth, and maybe, just maybe, find justice. Marcus's days at Mike's Auto Repair fell into a rhythm. He arrived early each morning, determined to master the new technology that had transformed his trade during his incarceration. Carlos proved to be an invaluable teacher, breaking down complex systems into manageable parts. "See this tablet?" Carlos would say, holding up the diagnostic tool. "It's just telling us what we used to figure out by listening and looking. The difference is, now we can see inside the engine without taking it apart." The learning curve was steep. Marcus's hands, calloused from prison work, still remembered the feel of tools, but everything else had changed. Cars were more computer than machine now. Each model required specific software, passwords, and protocols. Customer records weren't kept in filing cabinets anymore, but stored in the cloud, a concept that took Marcus weeks to grasp. During slow periods, Carlos helped Marcus navigate the modern world. They set up his first email account, taught him to use a smartphone, and explained how to order necessities online. Each new piece of technology represented another step away from his prison mindset, where time had stood still for 20 years. "You're picking this up faster than my old man," Carlos joked one afternoon while showing Marcus how to use social media. "He still thinks the internet is just for watching cat videos." But Marcus noticed how Carlos's expression changed whenever they discussed family or the neighborhood's decline. There was anger there, carefully contained but visible to someone who'd spent years reading subtle expressions to survive. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday. They were working on a police cruiser, routine, maintenance that brought a steady stream of law enforcement vehicles through the shop. Carlos was unusually quiet, his movements tense as he worked under the hood. "Something on your mind?" Marcus asked, passing him a wrench. Carlos glanced around the empty shop before speaking. "You see Officer Martinez's new watch? That's a $10,000 Rolex, on a cop's salary." He tightened a bolt with more force than necessary. "Same guy whose brother runs the biggest drug operation on the East Side. Nobody touches him. Nobody investigates. You know why?" Marcus remained silent, letting Carlos continue. "Because half the force is on the take. Detective Williams, he's not just corrupt, he's the one who manages it all. My cousin's girlfriend in the courthouse. She's seen the files. Cases disappearing, evidence going missing, witnesses changing their stories overnight." Carlos lowered his voice further. "Last month, a kid from my block tried to report a drug house. Next day, he got pulled over 3 times. Day after that, his mother lost her job at the city. Week later, they moved away." Marcus felt his heart rate increase, but kept his expression neutral. This was the first concrete lead he'd had about Williams since his release. "Sounds like nothing's changed in 20 years, he said carefully. "Changed. It's gotten worse." Carlos wiped his hands on a shop rag. "Williams got promoted because he knows where all the bodies are buried. Literally, some people say, the mayor, the DA, half the city council, they're all in his pocket." "You know what happened to the last reporter who tried to investigate him?" Marcus shook his head. "Nothing. That's what's scary. No accident, no frame-up, nothing. The story just never ran, and the reporter took a job in another state. Real quiet like." Carlos slammed the hood shut. "People around here, they've given up. They say that's just how things are now." That night, alone in his room, Marcus began his investigation. He'd learned patience in prison, 20 years of it. The internet, which had seemed so foreign weeks ago, now became his ally. He searched news archives, court records, anything public about Detective Williams. Most articles painted him as a hero cop, a crusader against crime. But there were patterns in the cases he handled, inconsistencies that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for them. Marcus started keeping notes, old school style, in a notebook he could hide. Names, dates, Connections. A pattern emerged. Cases where evidence vanished, witnesses recanted, or suspects pleaded guilty to lesser charges despite strong alibis. His own case fit the pattern perfectly. He knew he needed to be careful. If Williams had indeed grown more powerful, direct confrontation would be suicide. Marcus needed proof, the kind that couldn't be buried or explained away. But more than that, he needed allies. Carlos had given him a start, but taking on a corrupt system would require more resources, more connections. The question was, who could he trust? In prison, trust was a liability. Out here, it might be essential for survival. As Marcus added another name to his notebook, he realized he was no longer just an ex-con trying to rebuild his life. He was becoming something else, a threat to the system that had stolen 20 years of his life. And somewhere in the city, Detective Williams was still out there, probably unaware that his past was about to catch up with him. The article that changed everything was buried in the Metro Chronicle's digital archives from 3 years ago. Police Internal Affairs investigation questioned. Sources allege evidence tampering by Sarah Chen. Unlike other coverage of Williams, this piece hinted at darker truths, though it stopped short of direct accusations. The story had been quickly buried, relegated to page 12, and never followed up. Marcus read it 5 times, noting how carefully the journalist had laid out the facts while avoiding libel. Finding Sarah Chen proved challenging. The Metro Chronicle's website no longer listed her among their staff. Social media showed she'd gone freelance, operating a small investigative journalism website that specialized in local corruption stories. Her office address was a POO box, and her phone went straight to voicemail. Marcus left 3 messages before getting a response. A text message with an address and time. Coffee shop on 4th, 2 p.m. Come alone. Cafe Luna was the kind of place Marcus was still getting used to. All exposed, brick, and complicated. Coffee drinks with Italian names. Sarah Chen sat in the back corner, laptop open, back to the wall, clear view of both exits. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe early 30s, but her eyes carried the weary alertness of someone who'd seen too much. "You're persistent," she said as he sat down. "Most people give up after the first voicemail." She closed her laptop but kept her hand near it. "Why are you so interested in a 3-year-old story that nobody else cared about?" Marcus had rehearsed this moment, but sitting across from her, his prepared speech felt inadequate. "Because I lived it," he said instead. 20 years in Sterling State, courtesy of Detective Williams, and a murder I didn't commit. Sarah's expression didn't change, but her posture shifted slightly. "Marcus Thompson," she said, "I looked you up after your messages. Your case has some interesting parallels with others I've investigated. Missing evidence, witness intimidation, rushed trial." She paused. "But you already know that, don't you?" "I know enough to see the pattern. What I don't know is why your investigation stopped." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Stopped? It didn't stop. I was stopped." She pulled out her phone, scrolled through photos. "Here's my car after the brake lines were cut. Here's my apartment after the random break-in where nothing was stolen. Here's the letter explaining why my mortgage application was suddenly denied despite my perfect credit score." She put the phone away. "Message received, story killed, and I got to keep breathing." "But you didn't quit journalism." "I got smarter about it. Smaller stories, building evidence piece by piece. The website lets me publish without corporate oversight, but it also means limited resources. No legal team, no protection." She studied him carefully. "Why come to me now?" Marcus shared what he'd learned from Carlos, watching her take notes in quick, efficient shorthand. He described the patterns he'd noticed in Williams's cases, the connections he'd begun mapping out. "You understand what you're asking?" Sarah leaned forward. "Williams isn't just some corrupt cop. He's the linchpin of a system that's been in place for decades. The people he protects, they don't just break laws, they make them. They decide who gets contracts, who gets arrested, who lives and dies in this city. I understand exactly what I'm asking, Marcus replied. I lost 20 years. My parents died while I was inside. My sister disappeared. Everything I had was taken because I was convenient for their system. I'm not looking for revenge. I'm looking for justice. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, fingers tapping her closed laptop. Justice is a nice word, she finally said. But in my experience, it's a luxury for people with power. The rest of us just try to survive. Maybe that's why the system works. Because everyone's too scared to fight it. Or maybe because the people who fight it end up dead or in prison. She stood, gathering her things. I'll think about what you've said, but I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we go after Williams and his network, there's no halfway. They'll come at us with everything they have. Are you ready for that? Marcus met her gaze. I spent 20 years in a cell, thinking about nothing else. Sarah nodded once. I'll contact you in 3 days. If I don't, assume I've decided it's not worth the risk. If I do, she handed him a burner phone. We do this my way. No phones that can be traced. No emails. No digital footprints. And you need to be completely honest with me about everything. One surprise, one detail you've held back, and I'm out. After she left, Marcus sat for a long time, watching people come and go from the cafe. Sarah was right. This wasn't just about Williams anymore. It was about a system that had corrupted an entire city. The task felt impossible, but something had changed. He wasn't alone anymore. Between Carlos's inside knowledge and Sarah's investigative skills, they had a chance. The burner phone felt heavy in his pocket as he walked back to his apartment. 3 days to wait, to wonder if Sarah would decide the risk was worth it. 3 days to prepare for either the beginning of his fight for justice or another dead end in a city full of them. The sun was setting over the city skyline, casting long shadows across the streets. Somewhere out there, Williams was probably at his desk, secure in his power, unaware that the carefully constructed system he'd built was about to face its first real challenge in decades. Marcus smiled for the first time in days. The waiting didn't bother him. After 20 years in prison, 3 days was nothing. Sarah's call came at exactly midnight on the 3rd day. The meeting place was an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district, the kind of location that made Marcus's prison instincts kick into high gear. Carlos was already there when Marcus arrived, pacing nervously between stacks of old crates. This is where they used to store evidence before the new facility was built, Sarah explained, emerging from the shadows. She carried a leather messenger bag stuffed with files. The city accidentally deleted the digital records during the transfer, but paper copies have a way of surviving if you know where to look. For the next 3 hours, they pieced together a pattern that spanned decades. Sarah spread photographs, court documents, and financial records across the dusty floor. Carlos contributed what he'd heard from his contacts in the neighborhood. Marcus filled in gaps from his time inside, names and dates that connected seemingly unrelated cases. It's bigger than we thought, Sarah muttered, drawing lines between photos on a makeshift timeline. Williams isn't just covering up crimes, he's orchestrating them. Look at these property records. Every major drug bust in the last 15 years happened in buildings that were bought by shell companies a month before the raids. Carlos leaned in, pointing to a familiar address. That's the old Martinez warehouse. Cops seized it in a raid. City auctioned it off for pennies on the dollar. Now it's a luxury condo development, owned by a corporation that traces back to Williams's brother-in-law. Sarah finished. They're not just taking bribes. They're gentrifying the neighborhood through manufactured crime. A noise outside made them freeze. Sarah quickly dimmed her flashlight, but it was just a stray cat. Still, the moment reminded them of their vulnerability. We need to talk about Miguel Ramirez, Carlos said quietly. He's been trying to organize resistance in the neighborhood. Small stuff, community watches, recording police interactions, helping people file complaints. Last week, His brother got pulled over. Cops found drugs in the car. Plant? Marcus asked. Carlos nodded. Had to be. His brother doesn't even drink coffee, let alone deal drugs. But he's looking at 10 years, unless he convinces Miguel to back off. Sarah was already typing on her laptop. Ramirez. Here it is. The arresting officer was Jenkins. He shows up in multiple cases where witnesses suddenly changed their stories. She looked up. We need to talk to Miguel before they get to him. The decision to reach out to Miguel proved fateful. They met him in the back room of his mother's restaurant, where the smell of cooking provided cover for their conversation. Miguel was young, barely 25, but his eyes held the same determination Marcus remembered from his own reflection 20 years ago. They're watching me, Miguel said, stirring his untouched coffee. Not just cops, guys in suits. They followed my mother to church yesterday. My sister's scholarship got randomly selected for audit. He laughed without humor. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. We can protect you, Sarah offered. I have contacts at national media outlets. Once this story breaks, like it broke 3 years ago, Miguel interrupted. No offense, but I've seen how this plays out. People talk, stories get killed, lives get ruined. The system protects itself. Not this time, Marcus said, speaking for the first time, because this time we have proof, real proof. He nodded to Sarah, who opened her laptop. Bank records, she explained, turning the screen toward Miguel. Offshore accounts linked to Williams and half the city council. Evidence from old cases that never made it to court. Names, dates, connections, everything. We just need your help to prove it's still happening. Miguel studied the screen, then looked at each of them in turn. You know what you're asking. These people, they don't just threaten, they act. My brother will get your brother out, Marcus promised. But we need to do this right. No half measures, no backing down. Either we expose everything, or we don't move at all. The tension in the room was palpable as Miguel considered. Finally, he nodded. The community center. They're using it to distribute drugs, right under everyone's nose. Clean place, respected organization, perfect cover. I've been gathering evidence, but I can't get close enough to prove it. That's our way in, Sarah said, already typing. If we can document the distribution network, connect it to Williams. A crash from the front of the restaurant cut her off. Miguel was on his feet instantly. Back door, he hissed. Now, they barely made it out before heavy footsteps entered the back room. As they scattered into the night, Marcus caught a glimpse of men in tactical gear entering the restaurant. The message was clear. They were being watched, and time was running out. Later that night, in the safety of Sarah's makeshift office, they regrouped. The close call had shaken them, but it had also hardened their resolve. They're scared, Sarah observed, backing up their evidence to multiple secure locations. They wouldn't have moved so quickly if we weren't close to something big. Or they're sending a warning, Carlos added, letting us know they can get to us anytime they want. Marcus watched the city lights through the window, thinking of Miguel and his brother, of all the lives ruined by Williams and his network. Then we need to move faster, he decided. Sarah, can you arrange that press conference you mentioned? Get everything ready. She nodded slowly. It'll take a few days to set up securely. We'll need to coordinate with multiple outlets, arrange protection. Do it, Marcus said. It's time to bring everything into the light. None of them slept well that night, knowing that their next move would either break Williams's power or break them. The city hummed outside, unaware that its darkest secrets were about to be exposed. For Marcus, it felt like standing on the edge of a precipice, but this time, he wasn't alone in the fall. The Metro Convention Center's smallest conference room felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. Sarah had chosen the venue carefully, public enough to provide some safety, small enough to control access. Local news outlets filled the first 2 rows, their cameras already rolling. Behind them sat carefully selected community members, activists, and a handful of lawyers Sarah trusted. Marcus stood at the podium, acutely aware of the weight of the evidence folder in his hands. Sarah sat to his left, Carlos to his right. Miguel was supposed to be there too, but he hadn't shown up yet. The empty chair seemed to mock them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his prison-learned calm masking his tension. 20 years ago, I was wrongfully convicted of a murder I didn't commit. Today, I'm here to show you why that happened, and how it connects to a pattern of corruption that has poisoned this city for decades." The first slides appeared on the screen behind him. Bank records, property transfers, case files. Sarah had organized everything meticulously, building an undeniable narrative of corruption. Marcus watched the reporter's expressions shift from professional disinterest to growing concern as the evidence mounted. He was halfway through explaining a series of suspicious property seizures when the first disruption came. A group of uniformed officers entered through the back doors, followed by men in suits. Detective Williams wasn't among them, but Marcus recognized several faces from his case files. "This press conference needs to end immediately," one of the suits announced. "We have credible information about a security threat to this facility." Sarah was already on her feet. "There is no threat here except to your careers. We have a constitutional right too." The fire alarm cut her off, its shriek drowning out all conversation. Sprinklers activated, drenching everyone. In the chaos that followed, Marcus watched helplessly as reporters began evacuating, clutching their wet equipment. Some tried to stay, but security was already herding them toward the exits. "The backup drives," Carlos shouted over the alarm, reaching for his backpack. A uniformed officer grabbed him, citing security protocols. Another officer approached Marcus, hand on his weapon. Sarah managed to slip her laptop into her bag before they reached her, but Marcus saw one of the suits speaking into a phone, his eyes fixed on her. Whatever they had planned, she would be a target. "Clear the building," the order echoed through the space. More officers poured in, creating a physical barrier between the presenters and their audience. In less than 5 minutes, the room had been emptied except for Marcus, Sarah, Carlos, and their unwanted security detail. "Detective Williams sends his regards," one of the suits said quietly to Marcus as they were escorted out. "He's disappointed you didn't learn your lesson the first time." Outside, the scene was chaos. Fire trucks arrived, their sirens adding to the cacophony. Reporters clustered on the sidewalk, but police lines kept them back. Marcus spotted several plainclothes officers filming everyone who had attended, a clear message to potential witnesses. They regrouped 2 hours later at a safe house Sarah had prepared, all of them still damp from the sprinklers. The mood was grim. "They were ready for us," Sarah said, checking her laptop for damage. "They knew exactly when and where to hit." "Miguel," Carlos said suddenly, "has anyone heard from him?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Marcus paced the small room, his mind racing. "They're sending a message. This is what happens when we try to go public. They control the narrative, the police, even the building systems." "We still have the evidence," Sarah pointed out, but her voice lacked conviction. "We could try again, different venue, better security, and risk someone getting hurt. Or worse." Carlos shook his head. "You saw those cops. They weren't there to keep peace. They were there to intimidate. Next time could be worse." The weight of failure pressed down on them. Every copy of their presentation had been confiscated by security. Sarah's backup drives were safe, but the moment to expose everything publicly had been lost. The reporters who had seemed so interested would probably run stories about a disrupted press conference and move on to safer topics. Marcus stood at the window, watching the street below for signs of surveillance. The city looked different now. Every passing car a potential threat. Every pedestrian a possible informant. They had underestimated Williams's reach, and the price of that mistake was still unknown. "We need to regroup," he finally said. "Figure out who warned them, how they knew our plans. And we need to find Miguel." Sarah was already typing, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "I have some contacts who might know where they took him." But Marcus looked up, her expression troubled. "They're not going to stop now. They know what we have. They'll come after all of us." The truth hung heavy in the room. They had taken their shot and missed. Now they were exposed, their evidence scattered, their allies frightened away. The system they had tried to expose had demonstrated its power, and the message was clear. Resistance was futile. But as Marcus watched his friends, Carlos nervously checking his phone for news of Miguel, Sarah grimly working her contacts, he felt something beyond the defeat. They had lost this battle, but they had also proven something important. Williams's network wasn't invincible. They had forced them to act openly, to show their hand. "We're not done," he said firmly. "They think this will break us, make us give up, but all they've done is show us what we're really fighting against. Now we know better. Next time, we'll be ready." The others looked at him, seeing the determination in his eyes. They had started this fight seeking justice. Now it had become something more, a war for the soul of their city. And wars, Marcus knew from his time inside, were won not by single battles, but by the ability to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. 3 days after the failed press conference, Marcus stood in front of his parents' graves for the first time since his release. The cemetery was quiet, the morning fog shrouding the rows of headstones in grey silence. Their markers were simple: Thomas Thompson, 1945 to 2007, and Marie Thompson, 1948 to 2010. No mention of their son in prison, their lives spent fighting a corrupt system until it broke them. He placed fresh flowers on both graves, his hands trembling slightly. The memories came flooding back. His father's last visit, already weakened by heart problems, but still promising to find evidence to clear his son's name. His mother's letters, growing shorter and shakier as cancer took its toll, until they stopped completely. The cold prison guard, who'd informed him of each death, watching him passively as Marcus's world shattered twice. "I should have been here," he whispered to the stones. "Should have been able to say goodbye." A twig snapped behind him. Marcus spun, prison instincts kicking in, but it was only Carlos, keeping a respectful distance. The young mechanic had insisted on coming, worried about Marcus being alone after everything that had happened. "My old man always said, cemeteries are for the living, not the dead," Carlos said softly, approaching. "Gives us somewhere to put our grief." Marcus nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, he found his voice. "They never stopped believing in me. Spent every penny they had on appeals, hired private investigators when they could afford it. The stress killed them both, and that's why Williams needs to pay," Carlos said, his usual easygoing manner hardening. "Not just for what he did to you, but for all the families he's destroyed." They walked back to Carlos's car in silence. The city was waking up around them, people rushing to jobs, kids heading to school, life continuing as if the press conference had never happened. But beneath the normal surface, things had changed. Miguel was still missing. Sarah had gone dark. Following security protocols they'd established, their evidence was scattered, their plans in shambles. At Mike's auto shop, they tried to maintain normalcy, working on cars while keeping watch for suspicious vehicles or unfamiliar faces. During a slow afternoon, Carlos finally voiced what they'd both been thinking. "We could leave," he suggested, wiping grease from his hands. "Start fresh, somewhere else. Lots of cities need mechanics." Marcus looked up from the engine he was working on. "Is that what you want?" Carlos's response was interrupted by a customer entering, an elderly woman they both recognized from the neighborhood, Mrs. Rodriguez. No relation to Carlos, had been coming to the shop for years. Today, she was crying. "They're taking my house," she sobbed as Carlos led her to a chair. "The bank says there are problems with the title. 20 years I've lived there, never missed a payment, and now they say I have 30 days to leave." Marcus and Carlos exchanged looks. The timing wasn't coincidental. "Same bank that denied Sarah's mortgage?" Carlos asked quietly. Marcus nodded. Mrs. Rodriguez wiped her eyes. "The worst part? My grandson Pablo. He tried to help. He's a lawyer, just passed the bar. He went to the bank to look at the paperwork. Next day, police stopped him, said they found drugs in his car. He's in jail now. His whole career. She broke down again. The message was clear. Williams and his network weren't just targeting them directly. They were going after anyone connected to them, spreading ripples of destruction through the community. That night, alone in his small apartment, Marcus pulled out the box of letters his parents had sent him in prison. He'd read them countless times, but tonight they felt different. Between complaints about rising property taxes and updates on neighborhood gossip, he saw what he'd missed before, hints of the same system they were fighting now. His father's construction company losing city contracts after refusing to pay bribes. His mother's church being pressured to sell their land to developers. A knock at the door made him tense, but it was only Carlos again. The younger man looked troubled. "I've been thinking," Carlos said, pacing the small room, "about what you said at the shop, about leaving. I can't do it. This is my home. These are my people. What happened to Mrs. Rodriguez? To Miguel? To Pablo? It's been happening for years. We just didn't see the pattern before." Marcus carefully refolded his mother's last letter. "It's not just about Williams anymore, is it?" "It never was," Carlos replied. "He's just the enforcer. The whole system is corrupt. The banks, the developers, the politicians. They're stealing our homes, our futures, our dignity, and they're counting on us being too scared to fight back." Looking at Carlos's determined face, Marcus saw something of himself 20 years ago, before prison had taught him patience, before loss had taught him caution, but he also saw something new, hope. "Sarah will contact us soon," Marcus said, making a decision. "When she does, we're not going to run, we're not going to hide. We're going to fight smarter." "How?" Marcus smiled grimly. "By giving them what they fear most. Proof that resistance is possible. Williams took my family, but he gave me something too. 20 years to learn how systems work, how power flows, how to be patient." He gestured to the letters. "My parents never stopped fighting, neither will we." As Carlos left, Marcus stood at his window, watching the city lights. Somewhere out there, Williams was probably celebrating his victory, thinking he'd crushed another threat to his power. But he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd given Marcus a new family to fight for, and this time, Marcus wouldn't be fighting alone. Sarah's message came through an unexpected channel, a classified ad in the local penny saver, seeking vintage auto parts. "Must be original condition. Meet at Paradise Gardens, 7 p.m. To anyone else, it would look like another collector's posting. To Marcus and Carlos, it was the signal they'd been waiting for. Paradise Gardens was neither paradise nor a garden, just a rundown botanical center on the city's outskirts. Closed for renovation 3 years ago, but never reopened. Another failed development project that reeked of Williams's influence. Sarah was waiting in the abandoned greenhouse, her laptop casting a blue glow on the dusty glass. She looked exhausted, but focused. "We found Miguel," she said without preamble. "He's alive. They're holding him at county, officially, for questioning about some cold cases. At least he's in the system," Carlos said, relief evident in his voice. "They can't make him disappear." "No, but they can pressure him," Marcus noted. "His brother's still facing charges." Sarah nodded, pulling up documents on her screen. "But that's not why I called you here. Look at this." She turned the laptop around, showing a calendar entry for an upcoming political fundraiser. Senator Morrison is announcing his re-election campaign next week. Black tie event at the Grand Hotel. Every power player in the city will be there, including Williams. Marcus studied the details. Heavy security, invitation only. How does this help us? Sarah's smile was sharp. "Because I have press credentials. And more importantly, I have this." She produced a small USB drive, complete audio of Williams' meeting with Morrison 3 months ago. They discuss everything: the property seizures, the drug operations, the kickbacks. Morrison even jokes about my accident that never happened. "How did you get this?" Carlos asked, impressed. Morrison's chief of staff has a gambling problem. He also has a conscience, apparently. Reached out to me last week, said he couldn't sleep anymore. She pocketed the drive. We're not the only ones tired of the corruption. Marcus considered the implications. So we exposed them at the fundraiser, in front of everyone. Better, Sarah said. We let them expose themselves. The chief of staff provided me with documents showing how they'd been laundering campaign contributions through fake charities. I've already passed copies to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. They'll be watching the fundraiser, waiting to see who meets with whom. Williams is too smart to do anything obvious, Marcus cautioned. He is, Sarah agreed. But Morrison isn't. He's arrogant, thinks he's untouchable. And when the FBI moves in, Williams will have to make a choice. Protect his political patron or protect himself. The plan took shape over the next hour. Sarah would attend as press, recording everything. Carlos would work security. The hotel had contracted extra staff through an agency where he had connections. Marcus's role would be the most dangerous. He would attend as a waiter, positioned to observe and, if necessary, intervene. They spent the next 5 days in preparation. Sarah drilled them on the hotel's layout, security protocols, and escape routes. Carlos practiced with the security equipment until he could operate it in his sleep. Marcus learned every detail of high-end food service, knowing his cover had to be perfect. The night of the fundraiser arrived, cold and clear. Marcus adjusted his bow tie in the hotel's staff bathroom, remembering similar motions from prison uniforms. The catering uniform felt like another kind of cage, but this time he was choosing to wear it. Testing, testing. Sarah's voice came through his concealed earpiece. Everyone online, security booth is clear, Carlos confirmed. I've got eyes on all main exits. Marcus checked his watch. Service starts in 20 minutes. Williams just arrived with his security detail. The Grand Hotel's ballroom gleamed with wealth and power. Marcus moved through the crowd with practiced invisibility, serving champagne and observing. He spotted Williams near the stage, looking relaxed in an expensive suit, laughing with other officers. Senator Morrison worked the room like the career politician he was, each handshake accompanied by that practiced smile. Everything was proceeding according to plan until Marcus noticed something wrong. The hotel's regular security chief was speaking urgently into his radio, looking directly at Carlos's position in the security booth. Carlos, get out of there, Marcus hissed into his mic. There, the lights went out. In the sudden darkness, Marcus heard screams, breaking glass, and the unmistakable sound of doors being sealed. When emergency lighting kicked in seconds later, he saw armed men in tactical gear at every exit. Not police, private security. Sarah, abort, he whispered, but there was only static in his earpiece. Through the chaos, he spotted Williams moving purposefully toward the security booth. The detective's relaxed demeanor was gone, replaced by cold efficiency. He knew. Somehow, he'd known all along. Marcus had seconds to make a decision. The serving cart beside him contained their backup drive, hidden in a false bottom. If Williams's men found it, he grabbed the cart and headed for the kitchen, trying to maintain his waiter's composure while his mind raced. Behind him, he heard Williams's voice, amplified by a megaphone. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We have a security situation. Private security will escort everyone to safety after a brief screening. Marcus knew what that meant. They would search everyone, find Sarah's equipment, Carlos's security credentials, the evidence. Everything they'd worked for would be lost. Unless he pushed through the kitchen doors, already reaching for the cart's hidden compartment. They had prepared for this possibility, but the backup plan was risky. Everything would depend on timing, and on whether Sarah and Carlos could play their parts. The sound of footsteps behind him told him his time was up. Marcus straightened, turned, and faced what was coming, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just his fate, but the fate of everyone who would dare to stand against Williams's corrupt empire. The kitchen's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Marcus faced 4 of Williams's private security team, their weapons not quite drawn but hands hovering near holsters. Behind them, the kitchen staff huddled against the walls, wide-eyed and silent. "Step away from the cart," the lead guard ordered. His tactical vest bore no insignia, typical of Williams's deniable assets. Marcus complied, his movements deliberate. 2 decades of prison yard encounters had taught him to read situations like this. These weren't regular rent-a-cops. Their stance, their positioning, these were ex-military, probably private contractors, the kind of muscle Williams used when things got serious. "Just a waiter," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady, following protocol for secured areas. His hand brushed against the cart's hidden compartment, feeling the slight ridge that concealed their evidence. A commotion erupted from the ballroom. Through the kitchen's swing doors, Marcus caught glimpses of Sarah being escorted by more security personnel, her press credentials dangling useless around her neck. She caught his eye for a split second, a look that said everything was proceeding according to plan. The lead guard's radio crackled. "Subject to secured in the security booth. Sweep the kitchen and loading dock." Marcus knew subject 2 was Carlos. The fact that they were using code names meant this wasn't just about stopping their operation. This was a cleanup job. Williams was tying up loose ends. "Sir," one of the guards called out, examining the cart. "There's something." The lights went out again, but this time, it wasn't just the hotel. Through the kitchen windows, Marcus saw darkness spreading across the city blocks. A blackout, exactly as they'd planned. In the confusion that followed, several things happened at once. The emergency generators kicked in, casting everything in dim red light. The guards' radios erupted with chatter about building security, and most importantly, the kitchen's fire suppression system activated, filling the air with white powder. Marcus moved. 20 years of working out in a prison cell had kept him strong, and surprise was on his side. He appended the cart, sending plates and glasses crashing. The guard reaching for the hidden compartment stumbled back. Marcus was through the loading dock door before they could reorient. The alley behind the hotel was dark, but Marcus knew every inch from Sarah's meticulous planning. He counted steps. 3 left, 7 straight, then right at the dumpster. A figure emerged from the shadows. Carlos, breathing hard but grinning. "Security systems are completely down," Carlos reported as they ran. Their communications to Sarah's contact in it came through. She'd get out okay. Better. She's still inside, exactly where she needs to be. They reached the rendezvous point. A nondescript van parked 2 blocks away. Inside, surveillance monitors showed feeds from tiny cameras they'd planted throughout the hotel over the past week. On one screen, Sarah was being detained in a service corridor, right next to the hotel's main electrical room. "Williams is sweating," Carlos observed, pointing to another monitor. The detective was in the ballroom, trying to maintain control of increasingly angry political donors. "Senator Morrison looks like he's about to have a stroke." Marcus checked his watch. How long until he was cut off by a new wave of chaos on the monitors? FBI agents were entering the hotel, their raid jackets clearly visible in the emergency lighting. Not part of their original plan, but a welcome addition. "Sarah's source must have come through," Carlos said. Feds moved up their timeline when they saw Williams's people taking over the building. On screen, they watched Williams react to the FBI's arrival. The detective's composed facade cracked for the first time, showing real fear. He moved quickly to a side door, spoke urgently to a security team, then disappeared down a hallway. "He's heading for his escape route," Marcus said. Through the electrical room, Carlos smiled, where Sarah is waiting with a hot microphone and that recording of him with Morrison. The plan had worked. Not their original plan, but the backup they'd prepared for exactly this scenario. They'd known Williams would likely discover their operation. The key was making him think he'd discovered all of it. "What about the evidence from the cart?" Carlos asked. Decoy, Marcus replied. The real drives were never in the hotel. Sarah's had them broadcasting everything to secure servers since this started. Williams's entire operation, his deals with Morrison, his security team taking over a public event. It's all being streamed live to every major news outlet in the country. They watched the monitors as Williams entered the service corridor. Sarah's voice came through their speakers, calm and clear. Detective Williams, would you like to comment on your meeting with Senator Morrison 3 months ago? The one where you discussed eliminating potential problems? Williams froze. Behind him, FBI agents were approaching. Ahead, more agents emerged from the electrical room. He was boxed in, and the look on his face showed he knew it. But then something changed in Williams's expression. He reached slowly into his jacket. Sarah, get out of there, Marcus said into his radio. He's not going to. The service corridor feed went dark. Marcus was already moving, heading for the hotel's back entrance. Carlos grabbed his arm. Wait, look. On the remaining monitors, they saw FBI agents swarming the corridor. Williams was on the ground, being handcuffed. Sarah stood nearby, shaken but alive, her phone still recording everything. You okay? Marcus asked through the radio. Better than okay, Sarah replied, her voice trembling slightly. Got his confession, all of it, he thought. He thought he could threaten his way out of it. Didn't realize he was broadcasting live to half the country. Marcus sat back in the van, letting out a long breath, but he knew Williams well enough to know this wasn't over. The detective was just one part of a larger system, and judging by the look Williams had given the cameras before being led away, he still had cards to play. We should go, Carlos said, starting the van, before his other assets realize what's happened. Marcus nodded, watching the chaos unfold on the monitors. They'd won this round, but the war wasn't over, not by a long shot. The aftermath of Williams's arrest should have felt like victory. Instead, Marcus spent the next 48 hours in a state of hypervigilance, watching for the system's response. It came on a quiet Sunday morning, not with violence, but with a text message on Carlos's phone, a photo of his mother working in her garden, taken from across the street, followed by an address. They have my family, Carlos said, his voice hollow. He stood in Marcus's apartment, showing him the series of messages that had followed. They want the rest of the evidence, all of it, or he couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus studied the messages. The address was for an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district, the kind of place where people disappeared. How long? 2 hours. Carlos checked his watch again, hands shaking. They said come alone. No cops. No Polícia Federal Norte-Americana. No media. Sarah, who'd been monitoring police channels from her laptop, looked up. It's not Williams. He's still in custody. No communications allowed. This is someone else. Someone higher up. Doesn't matter who it is, Carlos said, grabbing his keys. I have to go. My family. Wait. Marcus caught his arm. Think. Why now? Why like this? Because we hurt them, Sarah answered, already typing. Williams's arrest exposed part of their operation, but not all of it. They know we have more evidence, probably about the other players involved. They're desperate. Marcus nodded. Which means they're vulnerable. Carlos, what exactly did your mother say when you called her? That's the thing. She didn't answer. Neither did my sister. But the pictures. He pulled up another image on his phone, showing his mother and sister being escorted into a black SUV. Sarah leaned in, examining the photo. Wait, look at the timestamp. This was taken yesterday morning, before we moved on Williams. They didn't grab your family because of what we did. They already had them. The realization hit Carlos like a physical blow. They knew. They knew everything. Williams wasn't the only one watching us. No, Marcus said grimly. He was just the visible threat. The one they could afford to lose. He turned to Sarah. Can you get into the city's surveillance system? Track that SUV. Sarah was already working. Better, Carlos's mother's phone. It's still active, moving around the industrial district. Not at the address they gave us, but she pulled up a map. 3 blocks away. Another warehouse, officially owned by a shipping company that went bankrupt last year. A trap, Carlos said. They're waiting at one location while holding my family at another. Marcus began pacing, his mind racing through scenarios. Prison had taught him to think like his opponents, to see the layers within layers. They expect us to either walk into their trap or call the authorities. Either way, they win. If we show up at the meeting point, they eliminate us. If we go to the police, they'll know immediately. Sarah finished. They still have people inside the department. Carlos's family would disappear for good. So what do we do? Carlos demanded, desperation creeping into his voice. I can't just abandon them. Marcus stopped pacing. We use their playbook against them. Sarah, that evidence we've been holding back, the files linking the development companies to offshore accounts. Can you prepare it for release? She nodded slowly, understanding, dawning, a dead man's switch. If anything happens to us, everything goes public, Marcus confirmed. But we need more than that. Carlos, your cousin at the courthouse, can she get us the real estate records for that warehouse? Not just the bankruptcy filing, but everything. Maybe why? Because property is power in this city. Every corrupt deal, every laundered dollar, it all comes back to real estate. That warehouse isn't just a convenient location. It means something to them. The next hour was a blur of activity. Sarah worked her contacts in the media, setting up the dead man's switch. Carlos reached out to his cousin, who sent over documents showing a complex web of shell companies and property transfers. Marcus studied the warehouse's layout, remembering similar buildings from his time working construction before prison. Found it, Sarah announced finally. The warehouse was transferred 6 months ago to a subsidiary of Crown Development, the same company that's been buying up foreclosed properties in Carlos's neighborhood. Crown Development, Carlos repeated. That's Morrison's biggest campaign donor. Marcus smiled grimly. And now we know why they're so desperate. The evidence we have doesn't just implicate Williams or Morrison. It exposes their entire operation, the developments, the kickbacks, the forced foreclosures. They're not just corrupt cops and politicians. This is about remaking the entire city. Great, Carlos said bitterly. We uncovered a conspiracy. Meanwhile, my family is our way in. Marcus interrupted. They think they have leverage over us, but they've made 3 mistakes. First, they showed their hand too early. Second, they underestimated how much we know. And third, he paused, checking his watch. They forgot what I learned in prison. Sometimes the best way to spring a trap is to walk right into it. Sarah looked up from her laptop. Marcus, no, it's too dangerous. I'm going with you, Carlos insisted. Marcus shook his head. No, I need you and Sarah to take everything we have to the one person they can't control. He wrote down a name and address. Morrison's chief of staff, the one who helped us expose Williams. He's been gathering his own evidence for years. With what we have, it won't help my family, Carlos protested. Trust me, Marcus said, looking his friend in the eye. 20 years inside taught me something about power. The people who have it, they never believe the powerless can hurt them. That's their weakness. In 2 hours, I'm going to walk into their trap. And when I do, he laid out his plan. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal. But looking at Carlos's face, at the fear and desperation there, Marcus knew it was their only choice. The corrupt system that had stolen 20 years of his life was now threatening his new family. This time, he wouldn't let them win. As he prepared to leave, Sarah caught his arm. Marcus said what they did to you before. It was a mistake, he finished. They locked me up and forgot about me. Left me alone for 20 years to think about how power really works. He checked his weapon, not prison-made this time, but just as deadly. They're about to learn that was their biggest mistake of all. The warehouse loomed against the darkening sky, its abandoned shell a perfect metaphor for the city's corruption. Marcus approached alone, his footsteps echoing off concrete and steel. Heavy clouds threatened rain, and the air felt charged with something beyond just an approaching storm. Inside, the space was vast and mostly empty, save for a few scattered crates and rusted machinery. Light filtered through broken windows, creating shadows that shifted like living things. In the center of the space stood 3 men, not Williams's usual muscle, but something worse. These men wore expensive suits and carried themselves with the casual arrogance of true power. Marcus recognized Robert Crown of Crown Development from news photos. The other 2 were unfamiliar, but their bearings suggested old money, entrenched influence. Behind them, 2 armed guards watched the entrances. "Mr. Thompson," Crown said smoothly, "so good of you to join us. I trust you brought what we asked for. Where's Carlos's family?" Crown smiled thinly. "Safe, for now." "The evidence," Marcus held up a USB drive. "Everything we have, Williams, Morrison, the development deals, the offshore accounts. Delete it, and this ends." "Oh, I rather think it began long before this," Crown replied. 20 years ago, to be precise. "Did you never wonder why you were chosen? Why, out of all the possible scapegoats, Williams picked you?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd spent 20 years wondering exactly that. "Your father's construction company," Crown continued. "Small operation, but respected. When we started acquiring properties in East Side, he was uncooperative, refused to sell his lots, started talking to other holdouts, became, shall we say, an impediment to progress. So you had Williams frame me," Marcus said, the pieces finally falling into place. "To break him. Business is business, Mr. Thompson. Your father learned that just as Carlos's family will learn it." Crown gestured to one of his companions, who opened a laptop. On the screen, live footage showed Carlos's mother and sister in a small room, guarded but unharmed. "Now, the evidence." Marcus took a step forward, then stopped. Something in the footage caught his eye, a detail that made him smile. "Funny thing about power," he said. "Real power. It's not about money or influence. It's about knowing things other people don't want known." Crown's smile faltered slightly. "The drive, Mr. Thompson. That room," Marcus continued. "3rd floor of the Crown Plaza, development downtown. Not a warehouse at all. Interesting choice." The atmosphere in the warehouse shifted. The guards tensed. "You're very observant," Crown said coldly. "Unfortunately, the windows," Marcus interrupted. "They show the city lights. But there's construction blocking that view now. Has been for weeks. That footage is old." Crown's facade cracked. One of his companions muttered something urgent in his ear. "You don't have them anymore, do you?" Marcus pressed. "They're already safe, just like you don't control the police department anymore since Williams talked. Just like you don't control Morrison since the FBI froze his accounts." "Kill him," Crown ordered. But Marcus was already moving. The explosion that rocked the warehouse came not from gunfire, but from the main entrance. FBI tactical teams poured in, led by Sarah herself, wearing a bulletproof vest emblazoned with media. Behind her came Carlos, accompanied by his very free, very angry family. "Robert Crown," Sarah announced, her voice carrying over the chaos. "You're live on every major news network in the country. Would you like to comment on your involvement in the systematic corruption of city development projects?" Crown and his associates found themselves surrounded, their guards already disarmed. Through the broken windows, news, helicopters, searchlights illuminated the scene. "How?" Crown demanded, facing Marcus. "Like I said, power is about knowing things. Like knowing your chief of security has a conscience, or that your private servers aren't as secure as you think, or that a man who spent 20 years in prison might learn a thing or two about patience." Carlos's mother stepped forward, her dignity intact despite her ordeal. "We've been working with the FBI for months," she revealed. "Ever since you first tried to force us out of our homes. My son isn't the only one who knows how to fight back." The evidence on the USB drive was real, But it wasn't the only copy. While Crown and his associates had focused on Marcus, Sarah had been broadcasting their entire conversation live. Their confessions, their threats, their revelations about the 20-year-old framed job, all of it captured and transmitted to millions. As the FBI led Crown and his associates away, Marcus stood with his new family, Carlos, Sarah, and the community they'd fought to protect. Rain finally began to fall, washing away to decades of injustice. "What happens now?" Carlos asked, watching the news crews swarm the scene. Now, Marcus looked out at the city's skyline, seeing it with new eyes. "Now, we rebuild. The right way this time." Sarah was already typing on her laptop. "The stories everywhere. Crown's empire is collapsing. The FBI's expanding their investigation to other cities. This isn't just about our city anymore. It's exposing corruption across the country." Marcus felt the weight of 20 years lifting from his shoulders. His parents hadn't lived to see this day, but their fight, his fight, had finally ended in victory. Not just personal revenge, but something larger, justice for an entire community. "My mother's making dinner," Carlos said. "Real home cooking, not prison food. You're both coming, right?" Marcus looked at his friends, no, his family, and smiled. Wouldn't miss it. As they left the warehouse, the rain grew stronger, cleansing the city of its old corruption. Marcus knew there would be more battles ahead. Other cities, other corrupt systems to fight. But for now, he had something he'd lost 20 years ago. A home, a family, and a future free from the shadows of the past. The last of Williams's corrupt empire had fallen, not through violence or revenge, but through the very thing they tried to destroy. Community. Marcus had entered prison seeking vengeance, but he'd found something more powerful. Justice. Real justice. Not just for himself, but for everyone the corrupt system had tried to crush. As Carlos's mother's cooking filled the small house with warmth, and the news continued to break across every channel, Marcus realized that his 20 years hadn't been stolen after all. They'd been preparation for this moment, teaching him the patience and wisdom needed to bring down not just one corrupt cop, but an entire system of corruption. The rain continued to fall, washing away the old city and nurturing the seeds of something new, something better, something worth fighting for.